The first sign of damnation came not as a whisper, but as a roar. Fire orange and ravenous devoured the night. It clawed at the dry timbers of the barn Jedediah Jed Stone had raised with his own hands, a monument to a life he had tried to build from the ashes of another. He stood frozen on the porch of his small ranch house, the heat a physical blow against his face, the inferno's reflection dancing in his wide, disbelieving eyes. The smell of burning hay and pine, once the scent of honest labor, was now the stench of violation. Shadows on horseback flickered against the wall of flame, their forms distorted and demonic. They were a pack of phantoms, their faces obscured by dark bandanas, moving with a chilling purpose that spoke of more than random cruelty. Jed's hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, a relic from a time he had sworn to forget. The cold steel was a familiar weight, a grim comfort. But there were too many of them, at least half a dozen, and they were not just burning his barn. They were encircling his home. His world had shrunk to this isolated patch of land, a quiet penance for the sins of his youth. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, he had sought peace. He had buried his gunslinger past alongside his wife Sarah and their infant son, both taken by a fever that had swept through the territory 5 years prior. All he had left of them was this ranch and a small silver locket. The thought of the locket struck him with the force of a physical impact. It rested in a carved wooden box on the mantelpiece, a small, cool oval of silver, engraved with a single, delicate rose. Inside, a miniature portrait of Sarah, her smile a ghost that haunted his waking hours. It was more than a memento. It was the anchor of his soul. As if summoned by his fear, the front door of the house splintered inward. 2 masked men stormed into the modest living space. Jed didn't hesitate. The Colt was in his hand, and the hammer cocked the sound a sharp, definitive click in the chaotic symphony of the fire. "Get out!" He growled, his voice a low rumble of gravel and grief. The intruders froze, seeing the cold certainty in his eyes. They were thugs, not killers, their bravado melting under the gaze of a man who knew precisely how to use the weapon he held. But a third figure appeared behind them, taller and leaner than the others. He moved with an unnerving calm, his eyes visible above the mask, holding a glint of cruel intelligence. He paid Jed's gun no mind. Instead, his gaze swept the room, landing on the mantelpiece. The box, the leader said, his voice a clean, sharp command that cut through the noise. One of his men, emboldened, lunged for it. Jed fired. Not at the man, but at the floorboards an inch from his boot. The wood exploded in a shower of splinters. The man yelped and scrambled back. But the distraction was all the leader needed. He moved with a snake's speed, snatching the wooden box himself. He didn't open it. He simply held it, weighing it in his hand, as if assessing the weight of Jed's life. "This is just the beginning, Stone," the leader said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A debt is owed." He turned and was gone, his men melting back into the night with him. Jed stood paralyzed, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the smoke that now filled his home. He could have shot them. He could have stopped them. But the mention of a debt had frozen the blood in his veins. This wasn't a random raid. This was a reckoning. The roar of the fire outside seemed to mock him. The barn, which had held a lifetime of sweat and hope, was collapsing into a roaring pyre. The heat was blistering, the smoke choking, but Jed felt a coldness spread through his chest that no flame could touch. They hadn't just burned his barn. They had stolen his past, ripped the heart from his carefully constructed solitude. The loss of the locket was a profound and absolute violation. It severed his last tangible link to Sarah, to the man he had tried to become for her. The self-imposed isolation he had cultivated for 5 years shattered in an instant. This was not about land or survival anymore. It was about recovering the last piece of a broken promise. It was about confronting the ghost that had ridden out of the night to claim its due. As the last roof beam of the barn crashed into the inferno, sending a geyser of sparks into the star-dusted sky, Jedediah Stone knew his penance was over. The gunslinger he had tried to bury was stirring from his shallow grave. He holstered the Colt, its warmth spreading through his thigh, and turned his gaze toward the distant, flickering lights of the nearest town. Redemption. The name was a bitter irony, a destination he now had to ride for, not in search of peace, but in pursuit of war. The ride to redemption was a journey through a purgatory of dust and memory. The sun rose behind Jed, casting his long shadow before him as he pushed his weary mare across the parched expanse. The landscape was a canvas of harsh beauty, of sun-bleached earth, and mesas carved by wind and time, standing like silent sentinels over a land that offered no easy quarter. With every mile, the smoke from his ruined ranch faded behind him, but the cold fury in his heart grew hotter. He replayed the attack over and over, the leader's words echoing in his mind. "A debt is owed." It was a phrase that reached back a decade to a different town, a different life. A life of smoke-filled saloons and the deadly calculus of the quick draw. He had been fast, one of the fastest, a reputation that had brought him nothing but trouble. And eventually, the tragedy that had driven him to this corner of the world to disappear. He had thought he'd paid all his debts in blood and tears. He was wrong. As the town of redemption came into view, it looked like a mirage shimmering in the heat. It was a place where dust settled like a fine red shroud on every thirsty plank and warped sign. The single main street was flanked by a collection of weathered buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with swinging doors that seemed to sigh with every gust of wind, and at the far end, the sheriff's office, its facade, a study in peeling paint and neglect. As Jed rode down the street, the town's morning bustle seemed to falter. Faces turned toward him, eyes lingering on the grim set of his jaw, and the Colt tied low on his hip. A blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Women herding children across the dusty thoroughfare pulled them closer. They weren't looking at a grieving rancher. They were seeing a ghost from the kind of dime novels they read in secret. Jed felt their fear like a physical presence. It was a familiar, unwelcome cloak. He knew this fear wasn't just for him. It was deeper, a pervasive unease that clung to the town like the dust itself. He swung down from his horse in front of the sheriff's office, the jingle of his spurs, a sharp metallic sound in the sudden quiet. He tied the reins to the hitching post and took a moment, his hand resting on the warm leather of his saddle. He looked at the faces watching him from behind curtained windows and shadowed doorways. He saw farmers, merchants, decent folk trying to carve out a life. And he saw the same thing in every pair of eyes, a desperate hope that whatever trouble he was bringing would pass them by. He pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and cheap tobacco. A man sat behind a large desk, his gut straining the buttons of his vest. He had a round, sweating face and small, shifty eyes that darted toward Jed before quickly looking away. A tin star was pinned crookedly to his chest. This was Sheriff Miller. Sheriff Jed said, his voice flat. He didn't bother to remove his hat. Miller cleared his throat, shuffling a stack of papers with hands that seemed too small for his thick wrists. "Stone. Heard there was some trouble out at your place last night. Big fire." "Trouble is one word for it," Jed replied, stepping closer to the desk. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "A half-dozen men burned my barn to the ground. They broke into my house." Miller leaned back in his chair, a practiced look of bureaucratic concern settling on his features. "Vagrants, most likely. Times are hard. They get desperate." "They weren't vagrants," Jed said, his voice dropping each word, a carefully placed stone. "They were organized. They took something. Something specific. The sheriff's eyes flickered. It was a brief, almost imperceptible movement, but Jed saw it. Miller knew more than he was letting on. Took something. What did they take? Money provisions. A silver locket. Miller frowned, making a show of picking up a pen and dipping it in an inkwell. A locket, strange thing for drifters to steal. You get a look at them. Masks, Jed said, his gaze unwavering. But the man in charge, he said something. He said a debt was owed. At this, Miller's composure finally cracked. He set the pen down with a clatter, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. He avoided Jed's eyes, focusing instead on a wanted poster tacked to the wall behind him. Folks say all sorts of things, Stone. Could mean anything. It means something to you, Sheriff, Jed pressed, leaning forward, his hands flat on the desk. The wood was gritty with dust. Who owns most of the land around here? Who's been buying up ranches from folks who've had accidents? Miller's face paled. He licked his lips, his Adam's apple bobbing. Silas Blackwood is a respectable businessman, a pillar of this community. You start throwing around wild accusations like that, you'll be the one in trouble. The defense was too quick, too fervent. It was the sound of a man bought and paid for. Jed had seen it 100 times before. The law in these parts wasn't a shield for the innocent. It was a fence for the powerful. So you're not going to do anything, Jed stated. It wasn't a question. I'll file a report, Miller said, puffing out his chest in a weak display of authority. I'll ask around. But without evidence, without witnesses, my hands are tied. Jed straightened up, a cold smile touching his lips. It held no humor. Then I guess I'll have to untie them for you. He turned and walked out the door, slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed down the silent street. He stood on the boardwalk, the morning sun now high and hot. He was alone. The law was a dead end, and the town was paralyzed by fear. And the men who had attacked him were protected by the very person meant to uphold justice. He had known deep down that it would be this way. His past had taught him that the only justice a man could rely on was the one he made for himself. But making it alone was a fool's errand. He needed help. He needed someone who remembered the man he used to be, and who, God willing, wouldn't hold it against him. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle, turning the mare not toward his ruined home, but toward the dusty track leading out of town, toward the small, secluded cabin of the only friend he had left in the world. The trail to Gus's cabin was a path worn by memory as much as by wagon wheels. It wound away from the open plains and into the sparse, rocky hills that formed the territory's spine. Here the heat was less oppressive, shaded by gnarled piñon pines and junipers that clung stubbornly to the arid soil. Gus had chosen this spot for its solitude, a place where a man could listen to the wind and not the incessant chatter of other men. Jed found him behind his cabin, bent over a small vegetable patch with a hoe in his gnarled hands. Gus was a man carved from the land itself, his skin the texture of old leather, his back stooped from a lifetime of hard work. He had been the foreman on Jed's ranch before Sarah's passing, a loyal, steadfast presence who had quietly packed his things a year after the funeral, sensing Jed's need to grieve alone. He looked up as Jed approached, his pale blue eyes squinting against the sun. He leaned the hoe against a fence post and wiped his hands on his trousers. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, weary recognition. Knew I'd be seeing you sooner or later, Gus said, his voice a dry rasp. Heard the smoke was visible all the way from town this morning. Figured it was yours. It was, Jed confirmed, dismounting. He walked over to the water pump, the handle squeaking in protest as he worked it, and splashed cool water on his face, the dust turning to mud on his skin. You look like hell, Jedediah, Gus observed, his tone practical, not pitiful. I feel it. Jed admitted, drying his face on his sleeve. He looked at his old friend. Gus's face was a roadmap of a hard life, but his eyes held a steady, unwavering light. He was the one man Jed had ever trusted completely, besides his own father. They burned the barn, Gus. Broke into the house. Gus nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. Blackwood's men. It wasn't a question. I reckon so. Sheriff Miller was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. A short, humorless laugh escaped Gus's lips. Miller's been in Blackwood's pocket since the day Blackwood rode into this territory. Bought him clean star and all. He gestured toward two rickety chairs on his porch. Sit. You look like you're about to fall over. They sat, the old wood groaning under their weight. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. Gus pulled out a pouch of tobacco and a pipe, methodically tamping the tobacco down with a calloused thumb. They took something, Jed said, his voice quiet. Sarah's locket. Gus paused, the unlit pipe halfway to his lips. His eyes met Jed's, and in their depths, Jed saw a flicker of the same pain he felt. Gus had loved Sarah like a daughter. He understood what that locket meant. It wasn't silver and a picture. It was a chapel, a place of worship for a memory too sacred to lose. Why, Gus asked, his voice softer now. A locket's got no value to men like that. The leaders said they were there to collect a debt. Jed explained, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It's from before, Gus. From my old life. Gus struck a match and drew on his pipe, the sweet-smelling smoke curling into the dry air. He exhaled slowly. Thought you'd buried that life. I thought so too. Jed said, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. Looks like it dug its way out. He finally looked Gus in the eye, the raw plea for help visible for the first time. I'm going after them, Gus. I'm getting it back. Gus studied him, his expression unreadable. He took another long draw from his pipe. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of cicadas. Jed felt a familiar despair begin to creep in the loneliness of a man who had pushed everyone away and now had no one to turn to. He had no right to ask this of Gus, to drag him into a fight that wasn't his. This ain't just about a locket, is it? Gus said finally, his gaze sharp. This Blackwood. He didn't just send his dogs to scare you. He sent a message. Taking that locket, that was personal. He's not just after your land, he's after you. Jed nodded, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. Gus saw it. He understood. You go against Blackwood, you're not just going against him. You're going against the money, the power, the law in this county. It's a fool's errand, Jed. Suicide. Maybe Jed conceded, but I can't let this go. I won't. Gus fell silent again, staring into the contents of his pipe bowl. He seemed to age 10 years in that moment, the weight of the past and the bleakness of the future settling on his shoulders. He had seen what Jed was capable of, both the good and the terrible. He knew the violence that slumbered beneath Jed's quiet exterior. Finally, he tapped the ash from his pipe against the porch railing. He stood up, his joints creaking. He walked to the door of his cabin and paused, his back to Jed. I'm getting old, he grumbled. My bones ache when the wind changes, and my trigger finger ain't what it used to be. Dragging me into this is a damn fool thing to do. He turned his head, a wry, reluctant smile touching his lips. But I was always a fool for a lost cause. He disappeared inside the cabin. A moment later, he returned, shrugging on an old dusty coat. In his hand, he held a well-oiled shotgun. He broke it open, checked the chambers, and snapped it shut with a sound that was as final as a judge's gavel. All right, Jedediah, Gus said, walking down the porch steps. Let's go see about this debt. Hope, a feeling so foreign Jed had almost forgotten its shape, bloomed in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. The path to answers began in the saloon. It was the town's heart and its gutter, the place where secrets were spilled as freely as whiskey. Jed and Gus pushed through the swinging doors into a haze of smoke and the low murmur of conversation. The piano player in the corner, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, let his tune trail off into a discordant clatter. All eyes turned to them. Jed scanned the room. It was filled with the usual assortment of ranchers, drifters, and merchants. Among them, he spotted a few men who carried themselves with the lazy arrogance of hired guns. They bore the unofficial uniform of Blackwood's employ, clean clothes, good boots, and a shared look of contempt for the common folk around them. "We need to find one of the men from last night," Jed said under his breath to Gus. "Someone who'll talk." "Talking's the easy part," Gus muttered, back his hand resting near the shotgun he'd slung over his shoulder. "It's getting him to say something truthful that's tricky." Their investigation began not with questions, but with observation. They took a table in a dark corner, ordered whiskeys they didn't touch, and watched. They were looking for a crack in the facade, a man drinking too heavily, boasting too loudly, or showing a flicker of fear. After an hour, they found him. A burly man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow was holding court at the bar, his voice growing louder with every drink. Jed recognized the wide set of his shoulders from the night before. As they watched, the man pulled a coin from his pocket to pay for another round. It slipped from his fingers and rolled across the dusty floorboards, coming to a stop near Jed's boot. Jed bent down, picked it up, and saw it wasn't a coin. It was a shell, casing a brass .44-40 Winchester. He looked closer. There was a small distinctive scratch near the primer, likely from a faulty firing pin. He walked over to the bar, Gus a silent shadow behind him. He placed the casing on the bar next to the man's glass. "You dropped this," Jed said, his voice level. The man, whose name was Colby, glanced at the casing, then up at Jed. A flicker of recognition, then defiance, hardened his features. "That ain't mine." "Funny," Jed said, leaning in. "I found a dozen more just like it scattered around my barn this morning, the one that's still standing anyway." Colby's bravado faltered. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support from his fellow thugs. They watched, but made no move to interfere. This was his problem. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rancher Colby slurred, trying to regain his footing. "My barn burned down last night," Jed continued, his voice dangerously soft. "A gift from your boss, I imagine. But his boys were careless. Left things behind." He let his gaze drift from the shell casing to the man's boots. "Those are nice boots. Must be hard to keep the mud off them when you're sneaking around in the dark." Colby's face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. He pushed back from the bar, his hand dropping toward his pistol. "You got a lot of nerve." He never finished the sentence. Gus stepped forward, the muzzle of his shotgun pressing firmly into the soft flesh of Colby's side. The man froze, his eyes wide. "My friend here has a question for you." Gus said, his voice as calm and cold as a winter morning. "I suggest you answer it." Jed steered Colby out the back door and into the alley, away from prying eyes. The stench of stale beer and garbage hung in the air. Jed pushed him against the rough brick wall. "I want a name," Jed demanded. "The man who led the raid, the one who took the locket." Colby spat on the ground. "Go to hell." Jed's fist shot out a quick, hard jab to the gut that drove the air from Colby's lungs. The man doubled over, gasping. "Wrong answer," Jed said. "The man in charge. He said something about a debt." "What debt?" Colby coughed, shaking his head. "I don't know. Blackwood keeps his business his own. He just pays us to do a job." "Then you're no use to me." Jed said, turning away as if to leave. Panic flared in Colby's eyes. He knew what happened to useless men. "Wait," he gasped. "I don't know his name. None of us do. He's new. Not from around here. Blackwood brought him in special for this." He paused, catching his breath. "But I heard something. Just a whisper. Something about a town, down south, called Silver Creek." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Silver Creek. The place where his old life had ended. The place where he had faced a man named Thomas Blackwood in a dusty street and walked away, the sole survivor. Colby saw the look on Jed's face and scrambled to offer, more desperate to save his own skin. "And the boss?" "Mr. Blackwood. He's been saying things. Strange things. Not just about land. He talks about atonement. About how some sins can only be washed away with fire. Atonement, fire, a debt being paid. It was all clicking into place, forming a picture of chilling, meticulous revenge. This wasn't about driving him off his land for profit. It was a vendetta carefully planned and deeply personal. Silas Blackwood wasn't some stranger. He was Thomas Blackwood's brother. Jed stared into the gathering twilight, the pieces of his past rearranging themselves into a new and terrifying mosaic. The ghost he was hunting had a name, and it was a name he had created. He had killed Thomas, and now a decade later, Silas had come to collect. He left Colby gasping in the alley and walked back toward the main street with Gus. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and rust. Gus Jed said, his voice strained. "We're not fighting a land baron, we're fighting a ghost." He knew then that he couldn't wait for Blackwood's next move. He had to face him. He had to go to the heart of the beast and look his sin in the eye. The confrontation he had run from for 10 years was finally here. The Blackwood Ranch was an empire of cattle and conquest, sprawling across a valley that Silas had bled dry ranch by ranch. A formidable gate of wrought iron bearing a stylized B blocked the entrance. As Jed and Gus rode up, 2 armed guards stepped out from a watchpost, rifles held at the ready. "State your business," one of them said, his eyes hard. "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwood," Jed announced, his voice steady. "Tell him Jedediah Stone has come to discuss a debt." The guard's expression tightened at the name. He exchanged a look with his partner, then disappeared into the post. A few minutes later, he returned. "Mr. Blackwood will see you. Alone." He nodded toward Gus. "Your friend waits here." Gus gave Jed a worried look. "You sure about this, son?" "It has to be done," Jed said, swinging down from his horse. He handed the reins to Gus. "If I'm not back by sunrise, ride. Don't look back." Gus's jaw tightened, but he simply nodded. Jed walked through the gates, escorted by the guards, toward the main house. It was an opulent 2-story structure, a monument to wealth and power that seemed grotesquely out of place in the rugged landscape. It was designed not as a home, but as a fortress. He was led into a study lined with dark wood and leather-bound books. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Silas Blackwood stood by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his face clean-shaven, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He turned as Jed entered, and his eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, met Jed's. There was no visible anger in them, only a chilling, predatory calm. Mr. Stone Blackwood said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "To what do I owe the honor? Though I suspect I already know." "I want my locket back," Jed said, dispensing with pleasantries. Blackwood smiled, a thin, cold curve of his lips. Direct. "I appreciate that. But you are mistaken. You are not here for a locket. You are here because you have finally realized that your past is not a place you can hide from. He gestured to a leather armchair opposite him. Please, let us not be barbarians. Jed remained standing. My business with you is simple. Give me back what's mine and leave my land alone. Blackwood took a slow sip of his brandy, his eyes never leaving Jed's. Your land, your locket. You speak of possessions, Mr. Stone, as if they are all that can be taken from a man. You should know better. You who have taken so much more. He set his glass down on the mantelpiece and walked slowly toward his desk. He opened a drawer and removed a framed sepia-toned photograph, which he placed on the desk facing Jed. It was a picture of a man, a woman, and 2 small children. The man's face was achingly familiar. It was Thomas Blackwood. Do you recognize him? Silas asked, his voice soft. My brother. A good man. A husband. A father. He tapped the glass over the woman's face. His wife, Eleanor. And their children, Daniel and Grace. Jed's blood ran cold. He remembered the gunfight in Silver Creek. He had been a hired gun, then working for a cattleman in a range war. Thomas Blackwood was on the other side. They had met in the street at high noon, a classic tragic showdown. Jed had been faster. He had seen Thomas fall. What he hadn't seen, what he never knew, was that a stray bullet from his own gun had gone wide, crashing through the window of the mercantile behind Thomas. The official report called it an accident. Blackwood continued, his voice a low, venomous whisper. A stray shot during a lawful duel. But you and I know the truth, don't we? You rode into that town a paid killer, and for a handful of silver you erased my entire family from the face of the earth. Your bullet didn't just kill my brother. It passed through him and killed his wife, who was standing inside the store with their son. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and damning. The little girl, Grace, she died a week later. Of a broken heart, the doctor said. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of a decade of hatred. Jed felt as if the floor had fallen away beneath him. He had known he'd killed Thomas. He had carried that man's death along with others as a heavy stone in his soul. But he had never known about the woman, about the children. The life he had built, his marriage to Sarah, his hope for a family, it had all been an attempt to atone for being a killer. He now realized his penance had been based on a lie, a fraction of the truth. I didn't know. Jed breathed the words hollow. I didn't know. Blackwood mocked his calm facade, finally cracking his voice, rising with a terrible, contained rage. Do you think that matters? Do you think your ignorance absolves you? I have spent 10 years building this fortune, Mr. Stone. 10 years planning this moment. I didn't come here for your dusty patch of land. I came here for you. I bought this county, I bought the law, all so that I could stand here and watch you suffer as I have suffered. He moved closer, his face inches from Jed's. The smell of brandy was sharp on his breath. I burned your barn to remind you that everything you build can be turned to ash. And the locket? He laughed, a sound utterly devoid of joy. I wanted the one thing you had left of her. I wanted you to feel that specific, unique agony of having the last piece of your love in the hands of your enemy. I wanted you to be well and truly alone when I finally destroy you. The truth was a brutal, ugly thing. Jed was not an innocent rancher defending his home. He was a sinner facing a righteous devil of his own making. His quest for a stolen piece of silver had become a confrontation with his own soul. He had ridden here seeking justice, only to find himself standing in judgment. So what now? Jed asked, his own voice sounding foreign to him. You kill me. No, Blackwood said, stepping back, his composure returning. Death is too quick. A mercy. I am going to dismantle your world piece by piece. I will turn your neighbors against you. I will salt the earth you love. By the time I am done, you will beg me for the bullet. And that is when I will deny you. He smiled again, that terrible bloodless smile. Now get out of my house. Jed walked out of the mansion and through the gates like a man in a trance. He mounted his horse, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. He had looked his ghost in the eye and seen his own reflection. The ride back to Gus was the longest of his life. The revelation at the Blackwood Ranch had shattered Jed's world. He returned to Gus a different man, the righteous anger that had fueled him replaced by the heavy, corrosive weight of guilt. He explained everything, the words coming out in a flat, dead tone as they rode away from the ranch under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. Silver Creek, Thomas Blackwood, the wife, the children. A history he hadn't even known was his to bear. Gus listened in silence, his weathered face a mask of grim understanding. He did not offer condolences or excuses. He knew Jed well enough to know that such comforts would be hollow. So this ain't a fight for land, Gus said finally, as they made camp in a hidden arroyo miles away. It's a feud, and we're on the wrong side of it. There are no sides, Jed said, staring into the flickering flames of their small fire, just a circle of ghosts and blood. In the days that followed, Blackwood made good on his promise. His campaign of torment was not waged with guns, but with the slow, insidious poison of fear and economic strangulation. The water rights to the creek that fed most of the small ranches, including Jed's, were bought up by a shell company Blackwood controlled. Suddenly the creek ran dry, diverted to Blackwood's massive estate. Fields withered under the unforgiving sun. Cattle grew gaunt and thirsty. Then came the pressure on the town. The freight wagons that brought supplies to Redemption were suddenly delayed or rerouted. The shelves in the general store grew bare. The price of everything from flour to nails skyrocketed. Merchants who had extended credit to local ranchers for years were now forced to call in their debts, their own businesses threatened by Blackwood's unseen hand. The town, already wary of Jed, began to turn on him. He was the catalyst, the lightning rod that had drawn this storm. Whispers followed him whenever he rode in for supplies. Old acquaintances averted their gaze. The fear of Blackwood was now greater than their loyalty to a neighbor. They saw Jed not as a victim, but as the source of their suffering. Jed and Gus watched helpless as the community unraveled. They worked tirelessly to dig a new well on Jed's property, a back-breaking effort that yielded only brackish, undrinkable water. The ranch, once a symbol of Jed's redemption, was dying. One evening, as Jed was reinforcing a fence line, 3 of his neighbors rode up. They were good men he had shared drinks with, men who had helped him raise his now charred barn. Today their faces were hard and accusing. Stone, said the eldest, a rancher named Hanson. This has to stop. It's Blackwood doing this, Hanson, not me, Jed replied, his voice weary. It started when you picked a fight with him another man shot back. He was leaving us be until you stirred the nest. Our families are going hungry because of your war. This isn't my war, Jed tried to explain. It's something from a long time ago. We don't care about a long time ago, Hanson said, his voice cold. We care about now. Sell your land to him, Stone, or just leave. Give him what he wants so the rest of us can survive. The words were a gut punch. He was being asked to sacrifice his home, his last connection to Sarah, to appease a monster he had created. He looked at their desperate, angry faces and saw not malice, but the raw terror of men with everything to lose. And he knew they were right to blame him. This was his fault, His past had finally come to collect its due, and it was taking the whole damn territory with it. He returned to the shell of his ranch house that night, a broken man. The weight of his guilt was now magnified by the suffering he was causing innocent people. He sat on the porch, the same spot where he had watched his barn burn, and considered their words. Leave. It was the simplest solution. Disappear again, just as he had after Silver Creek. Let Blackwood have his victory. The town would be saved, and Jed would carry his ghosts to some new desolate corner of the world. Gus found him there, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. They're scared, Jed, that's all. They're right. Jed said, his voice barely a whisper. This is my fault, all of it. I should leave. Let Blackwood have the land. And run for the rest of your life, Gus asked, sitting beside him. Let this man, this vengeful spirit, chase you from place to place. That ain't living, Jed. That's just a slow death. He took a sip of coffee. And what about the locket? You just gonna let him keep it? Jed looked down at his hands. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a rancher, but he could still feel the phantom weight of a pistol grip in his palm. Maybe it's what I deserve. To lose everything. For what I did to his family. What you did was in another life, Gus said firmly. And you didn't know the whole of it. You've spent 10 years trying to be a better man. Does that count for nothing? You can't change what happened in Silver Creek. But you can change what happens here in Redemption. As Gus spoke, Jed's eyes fell upon a small, half-finished carving on the porch railing. It was a bird, a little wren, that he had been whittling for weeks in idle moments. He had started it for no reason. But looking at it now, he thought of Sarah. She had loved the wrens that nested in the eaves of the barn, their cheerful song the first sound of the morning. She had seen beauty and resilience in the smallest of things. Running away wouldn't honor her memory. It would be a betrayal of the man she had believed he could be. She had seen the good in him beneath the gunslinger's reputation. She had married him believing in his capacity for peace. A quiet resolve settled over him, displacing the despair. He would not run. He could not undo the past, but he would not let it destroy the future, not his and not the town's. He had to stand and fight. Not for vengeance, and not just for a silver locket. He had to fight for the chance at atonement that Blackwood was trying to steal from him. He had to fight for redemption itself. He wants to dismantle my world, Jed said, looking at Gus, a new hard light in his eyes. He's about to find out my world is a lot harder to break than he thinks. The first step was to give the town a reason to fight back. He had to show them that Blackwood's power was an illusion, one that could be shattered by men willing to stand together, and he knew just how to do it. The plan was desperate, a long shot born from the dark hour. Blackwood's power flowed from the water he controlled. If Jed could restore the town's access to the creek, he could give them back their hope, their means of survival. It would be a direct challenge, an act of open rebellion. The diversion dam Blackwood had constructed was several miles upstream, a crude but effective structure of rock and timber guarded by 2 of his men. Jed and Gus scouted it for 2 days, learning the guards' routines, the lay of the land, of the quietest approach. The attack would have to be at night, under the sliver of a new moon. The night of the raid was still and breathless. They moved like wraiths through the scrub and rock, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind. When they were within sight of the dam, they saw the flicker of a campfire. One guard was asleep, rolled in his blanket. The other sat staring into the flames, a rifle across his lap. "I'll take the one by the fire," Jed whispered, drawing the Bowie knife from his belt. A gunshot was out of the question. It would bring the rest of Blackwood's men down on them in minutes. You get the sleeper. Gus nodded, his face grim in the darkness. He crept away, circling around the camp. Jed moved forward, his steps silent, his focus absolute. He was a predator again, the skills of his old life returning with a terrifying ease. He closed the distance, the guard still oblivious. With a final rush, he was on him, one hand clamping over the man's mouth, the other driving the hilt of his knife into the man's temple. The man went limp, without a sound. At the same moment, he heard a soft thud from the other side of the camp. Gus had been equally efficient. They worked quickly, using sticks of dynamite Jed had borrowed from the mining office. They packed the charges into the dam's weak points, laid the fuses, and lit them. "Go," Jed yelled, and they scrambled back up the ravine, diving for cover as the fuses burned down. The explosion was a deafening roar that tore through the silence of the night, echoing off the canyon walls. A massive plume of water rock and splintered wood erupted into the air. When the debris settled, they heard a new sound, the triumphant rushing roar of the creek freed from its prison. Water surged down the dry creek bed, a life-giving torrent racing toward the thirsty ranches and the town of redemption. They rode back hard and fast, knowing Blackwood's retribution would be swift. By morning, the entire town was buzzing. The creek was flowing. The mood had shifted from sullen despair to a fragile, defiant hope. When Jed and Gus rode down the main street, the looks they received were no longer hostile. They were filled with a dawning, grudging respect. Hanson, the rancher who had told Jed to leave, met him in front of the general store. "That was you, wasn't it?" Hanson asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. Jed just nodded. "Damn fool move, Stone," Hanson said, shaking his head. "But thank you." The victory was short-lived. That afternoon, Blackwood and a dozen of his men rode into town. They moved with grim purpose, dismounting in front of the sheriff's office. Blackwood's face was a mask of cold fury. He had been publicly defied, his power challenged. He would make them all pay. Suddenly, the sky began to darken, not with twilight, but with an unnatural, sickly yellow haze. The wind picked up, howling down the street, kicking up clouds of dust and sand. A sandstorm, one of the worst in years, was bearing down on them. It was as if the heavens themselves were reflecting the turmoil below. Everyone inside the saloon. Blackwood bellowed over the wind, his voice cracking like a whip. Now, his men began herding the townspeople off the street, shoving them toward the swinging doors of the saloon. Sheriff Miller scurried out of his office to help, his face pale with fear. They were taking the entire town hostage. Jed and Gus were caught near the blacksmith shop. "We have to get in there," Jed said, his mind racing. A frontal assault was suicide. He looked around, his eyes landing on the hotel next to the saloon. They shared a wall. An idea reckless and desperate formed in his mind. As the last of the townspeople were forced inside the saloon and the sandstorm hit with full blinding force, Jed grabbed Gus. "The hotel roof," he yelled over the gale. "We're going in through the top." The world outside the saloon dissolved into a howling vortex of sand and fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the windows and forcing fine grit through every crack in the walls. Inside, the air was thick with tension and dust. The townspeople, men, women, and children, were huddled together, their faces pale in the gloomy lantern light. Silas Blackwood stood before the bar, flanked by his men, his composure a chilling island in the storm of fear. "This is what rebellion earns you," Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "You chose to follow a killer, and now you will share his fate." Meanwhile, Jed and Gus fought their way through the blinding storm to the back of the hotel. They scrambled onto a rain barrel and up to the low roof of an adjoining shed. From there, it was a treacherous climb to the second-story balcony of the hotel. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from their handholds. "There's a room up here that shares a wall with the saloon storage room," Jed shouted, pulling Gus onto the relative safety of the balcony. They found the window unlocked and slipped inside a dusty, abandoned hotel room. Jed pressed his ear against the wall. He could hear the muffled sounds from the saloon, Blackwood's voice, the whimpering of a child. Using his Bowie knife, he began to pry at the cheap pine boards of the wall. It was slow, painstaking work. Inside the saloon, the suspense was unbearable. A large grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly each second, a hammer blow marking the passage of their captivity. Blackwood seemed to be enjoying himself, drawing out the terror. He walked among the hostages, his gaze lingering on their fearful faces. He stopped in front of Sheriff Miller, who was sweating profusely. Sheriff Blackwood said with a predatory smile, "You seem nervous. One might think you have something to hide." Miller stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. "Perhaps you should tell these good people a story." Blackwood continued, his voice silky smooth. "A story about a town called Silver Creek. You were a deputy there, were you not, under a Sheriff Thompson?" All eyes turned to Miller. The sheriff looked as if he was about to collapse. I don't... "Tell them," Blackwood commanded, his voice turning to steel. "Tell them how you were the one who wrote the official report on my brother's death. Tell them about the bribe you took from Jedediah Stone's employer to omit certain details." The secondary twist was not as the instructions laid out. The instructions say, Miller took a bribe to frame Jed, not to omit details for Jed's employer. I will correct this. It makes more sense for Jed's character arc. Miller framed him, making Jed a pariah and forcing him to flee. This enhances Jed's isolation and the injustice he suffered. Let's redo this part of the climax. Blackwood's voice turned to steel. "Tell them, Miller. Tell them how you took a bribe from the cattle baron who was paying for my brother's death. Tell them how you altered the report to make Stone look like a cold-blooded murderer who shot an unarmed man. How you erased any mention of it being a fair fight, all to protect your paymaster and ensure the range war ended in his favor." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Miller began to tremble violently. "It wasn't like that. They made me." "You buried the truth for money." Blackwood roared, his control finally snapping. "You let them brand Stone a killer, a man who shot down a family in cold blood, when the full story was far more complicated. You helped create the myth of the monster, and in doing so, you helped create me." At that moment, a section of the back wall of the saloon exploded inward. Jed burst through the opening, his Colt Peacemaker roaring to life. He shot the pistol from the hand of the man nearest Blackwood. Gus followed his shotgun, booming, sending a spray of buckshot into the ceiling, raining plaster down on two more of Blackwood's men and sending them diving for cover. The saloon erupted into chaos. Jed moved with a gunslinger's fluid grace, using the bar for cover. He wasn't shooting to kill. He fired with precise, disabling shots at hands, shoulders, legs. He was no longer the killer from Silver Creek. He was a protector. Blackwood, enraged, drew his own pistol and fired at Jed. The bullet splintered the wood of the bar near Jed's head. Jed fired back his shot, hitting the grandfather clock. The ticking stopped. Time stood still. The room fell silent, the only sounds the moaning of wounded men and the howling of the wind outside. Jed stood at one end of the bar, Blackwood at the other. The townspeople were caught between them. Gus had the remaining henchman covered with his shotgun. It was down to two men, a decade of hate and grief between them. "It ends now," Blackwood Jed said, his voice ringing with authority. "It ended 10 years ago." Blackwood spat, his face a mask of anguish. "It ended when my family was put in the ground, because of you. And because of him, Jed said, nodding toward the cowering Sheriff Miller. He let you believe a lie. He let your hate fester because he was a coward. Killing me won't bring them back. It won't change the past. All it does is create more ghosts. Jed saw the conflict in Blackwood's eyes. The burning need for vengeance, warring with the sudden terrible truth of Miller's betrayal. This was his chance. Not to kill, but to break the cycle. He placed his Colt on the bar and slid it away. No more killing, he said, his hands raised. Let the truth be the only shot fired here tonight. It was a tremendous risk. For a long moment, Blackwood's pistol remained leveled at Jed's chest. The town held its breath. The storm outside raged. Slowly, with a shudder that seemed to rack his entire body, Silas Blackwood lowered his gun. The fire of vengeance in his eyes flickered and died, leaving only the cold, empty ashes of a decade of grief. Justice, not a bullet, had won the day. The silence that followed the lowering of Blackwood's gun was more profound than the preceding chaos. The sandstorm still howled outside, but within the saloon, the storm had broken. The townspeople moments before, captives, were now witnesses. Hanson the rancher was the first to move. He walked forward, his face set with a new resolve, and picked up a pistol dropped by one of Blackwood's wounded men. He looked not at Blackwood, but at Sheriff Miller. Sheriff Hanson said, his voice heavy with contempt. I'm placing you under arrest. For corruption, for conspiracy, and for being a damn coward. He then turned to Blackwood. As for you, you'll answer for what you've done to this town. The law you thought you owned is about to find its teeth. Other men from the town stepped forward, emboldened, disarming the rest of Blackwood's crew. They had found their courage, their collective will to fight for their own future. Justice was no longer an abstract concept, administered by a corrupt official. It was a living thing held in the hands of the community itself. Jed watched, a silent observer. He had not won this fight with his gun, but by appealing to the truth. Blackwood did not resist. The fight had gone out of him, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a man, consumed by a grief that his quest for revenge had only amplified. As he was led away with Miller, his eyes met Jed's one last time. There was no hatred left in them, only a vast, empty sorrow. In that moment, Jed saw not an enemy, but another man, broken by the past. When the storm finally passed and the sun broke through, it illuminated a town transformed. The dust settled, but the air felt cleaner, clearer. Gus clapped Jed on the shoulder, a proud, weary smile on his face. You did it, son. You gave them back their town. In the chaos, Jed had found what he was looking for. One of the townsfolk handed him the small wooden box recovered from Blackwood's coat pocket. He opened it. The silver locket lay inside, cool and untarnished. Sarah's face in the tiny portrait seemed to smile at him. He closed the box, the weight of it in his hand, a comforting finality. Weeks turned into months. Redemption began to heal. With Blackwood's empire dismantled and Miller awaiting a federal judge, the town started to rebuild, not just its finances, but its spirit. The creek flowed freely, and the ranches began to thrive again. Jed, with the help of his neighbors, rebuilt his barn bigger and stronger than before. He was no longer an outsider, but a part of the community he had saved. One clear, cool autumn afternoon, Jed rode out to the small, quiet hill where two simple wooden crosses stood side by side. He dismounted and walked to the graves of his wife and son. The grass here was green, nourished by the restored creek. He took the silver locket from his pocket, the metal warm from the sun. For a moment, he considered burying it with them, a final act of letting go of, putting the past to rest. But as he looked at Sarah's name carved into the wood, he knew that wasn't what she would have wanted. His memories of her, both joyful and painful, were not a burden to be buried. They were a part of him and the foundation of the better man he had become. He slipped the locket back into his pocket, keeping it close to his heart. Instead, he took out something else, the small hand-carved wooden bird he had finished. A little wren, its head cocked as if in song. He carefully placed it on the soil of Sarah's grave, a simple offering. It was not a symbol of an ending, but of a new beginning. A symbol of peace, of resilience, of a life ready to take flight once more. He had faced his ghosts and found not vengeance, but grace. He had earned his redemption. He stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of soft gold and purple. He felt the cool evening breeze on his face and listened to the sounds of the living world around him. He was at peace.